Good afternoon. Welcome to DCR's public meeting for the 2021 Forest Management Proposals. My name is Peter Church. I'm the Director of Forest Stewardship for the Department of Conservation and Recreation. Thank you for participating in this virtual public meeting. Your feedback is important to us. This is the second year that we've done this public meeting virtually due to the pandemic. This year we're using the Teams platform, so bear with us if there are any technical glitches or momentary pauses. And this presentation is also being recorded. I want to first introduce Tom Burley, our State Lands Management Forestry Supervisor. I'll be turning the meeting over to Tom in just a minute, but first want to introduce our technical support team that are behind the scenes to help us with these presentations. Malcolm Itter from UMass is the Assistant Professor of Environmental Conservation and will be our Q&A host during the presentation. Thank you, Malcolm. Malcolm is an impartial moderator and UMass is not endorsing any views in this presentation. Dan Cushing is DCR's Director of Public Engagement, and Mary Cardwell and Bill Van Dorn work within the Bureau of Forest Fire Control and Forestry, and they're all behind the scenes helping out with this technical program. At this time, I want to pass the presentation on to Tom. Take it away, Tom.
Well, thank you, Pete, and welcome everyone to the second presentation of the Forest Management Program's 2021 proposal presentation. Today we will hear from two foresters, Joel Vertour, who will present two projects, one on the Lawton State Forest and the second one, which will be on the Otter River State Forest. And then finally, we will hear from Paul Gregory with his unique Charge Pond project, which is located on the Myles Standish State Forest. But first, we have a brief presentation regarding the protocol for tonight's event. So thanks again, everyone, for attending.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending the proposal presentation for the Department of Conservation and Recreation Forest Management Program's 2021 Forest Management Proposals. I am Tom Burley, the new Forest Management Program Supervisor. I have been on board with the program for about 4 months now. Prior to accepting the program supervisory post, I was a forestry and wildlife consultant in the private sector for a little over 30 years. Today's meeting will run from 4 p.m. till 5:30 p.m. The meeting is being recorded and be made available by Teams Live. To help with logistical issues such as broadband limitations for some viewers, all attendees' video and audio will be turned off. Written questions and comments can be asked by typing in the chat box during the presentation and will be answered. Questions for which we do not have time available will be responded to. If you are unable to chat a question or comment, please send in writing to forestry.comments@mass.gov or call 413-545-3891 and leave a message. In 2012, DCR released the landscape designations for DCR parks and forests. This document is used across the department and the Forest Management Program as guidance for all its management activities. It includes land designation units as well as management policy. As part of the guiding document, DCR policy instructs the Forest Management Program to provide public information meetings to present information and answer questions regarding newly proposed projects. The Forest Management Program views these presentations as not only a beneficial venue for public education, we also view the meetings as an educational opportunity for the program as we learn different perspectives we may not have been made aware of. If there are technical problems with tonight's presentation, please direct your questions directly to the host. And before I forget, I would like to thank Malcolm Itter, Assistant Professor of Forest Conservation at the University of Massachusetts, for hosting the event. Thank you, Malcolm. Forest management proposals are developed annually. The proposals take into consideration the many stewardship goals the program strives to manage. Some of the forest stewardship goals include mitigation and adaptation practices for climate change, wildlife habitat, forest health, fire and public safety, biodiversity, forest products, local economies, and recreation. Once the forest management proposal is made, it goes through an internal review. During this process, comments are received from the Ecology Program, DCR's Cultural Resources Program, as well as Parks and Operations. Parallel with this internal review, there's an external review by the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, as well as the Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program. Once posted, the projects go through a 45-day public comment period. The 45-day comment period for the July 2021 proposals has been extended till August 31st. All of the proposals have been posted on the Bureau of Forestry's Department and Conservation Recreation's website. Again, if you have any specific project questions or comments, you may send them to forestry.comments@mass.gov. Next steps in project development, foresters will begin developing a stand inventory, creating individual stand and area prescriptions. Once developed, the process will move to project layout. Foresters will designate trees and vegetation to be removed, flag all sensitive areas, including wetlands and riparian areas, cultural sites. Landing areas and major forest roads are laid out in advance to minimize long-term damage while facilitating long-term access. This process includes the development of a Chapter 132 forest cutting plan. These plans are mandatory for both public and private lands for which more than 50 cords or 25,000 board feet of timber are cut in a calendar year. Once the plan is submitted, the project is reviewed by the Service Forestry Program, as well as another review by the Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program. Once the project is developed and all permits secured, the Forestry Program will continue its public outreach by conducting a pre-management tour. The tours will help explain to the public the long and short-term stewardship goals for the project. There are 6 proposals which will be presented. Tuesday's presentations will be those in Western Mass. The project entitled The Old House Project is within the Chester Blandford State Forest, presented by Forester Chris Massini. Chris will also be presenting a project on the Mount Washington State Forest, referred to as the Cattle Barn Project. The final presentation for the evening will be made by Forester Keith DiNardo. His presentation will be for the Burnham Road Management Project on the Northfield State Forest. Thursday's presentations will include 2 from Forester Joel Batur, the Willis Road Project on the Lawton State Forest, as well as the Beeman Pond Project located on the Otter River State Forest. Forester Paul Gregory will present his unique Charge Pond Project located on the Myles Standish State Forest. Reminder, the 2021 proposals are posted on our website. Project-specific comments or questions can be sent to forestry.comments@mass.gov. Below are some useful links to resources which may help you answer some of your questions regarding climate change mitigation and adaptation, as well as wildlife habitat management. Thanks to everyone who helped the forest program with tonight's presentations, and special thanks to all who are attending for your care and concern for the well-being of the Commonwealth's forests and all the values they bring us.
Okay, thank you. We'll now hear from Joelle Batur, and we'll be listening to her Otter River State Forest project.
Hello, my name is Joelle Batur, and I am the Mid-State Management Forester for the Department of Recreation, Division of State Parks and Recreation. This evening, I'll be presenting information regarding a harvesting project located within the Otter River State Forest at the Beeman Pond Lot. Otter River State Beeman Pond Lot is located off of Route 2 both Baldwinville and Winchendon, Massachusetts. It was purchased in 1915 by the State Forest Commission and it is the first state forest that was purchased by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It is located just north of Baldwinville, south of Lake Denison, and east of Birch Hill Flood Control Area and Birch Hill Wildlife Management Area. There are 3 separate parcels of land that make up the forest system, which totals about 1,200 acres. DCR also leases 4,000 acres from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. This parcel is a 290-acre isolated lot of the Otter River State Forest System. Approximately 174.4 acres of this state forest is being proposed for management at this time. Approximately 41 acres of that are located in Baldwinville, which is about 25% of the total area, and 133 acres are located in Winchendon. This acreage consists of red pine, white pine, Scots pine, and Norway spruce plantations. The plantations are about 85 years in age and were planted by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s. Otter River housed a camp there from 1933 until 1935. There has been a recent history of forest management on this property. The red pine plantation was treated in 1981, 1993, 2000, and 2017. The white pine plantation was treated in 1993 and 2017. The Scots pine and Norway spruce plantations had no evidence of treatment until 2017. Per the Forest Futures Visioning process and associated DCR management guidelines published in 2012, the Beeman Pond Lot is a designated parkland. It has this designation because the property has high recreational values, including an established campground, day-use picnic areas, a pavilion, hiking trails, and waterfront swimming opportunities. The long-term commercial production of wood for wood products is not an intended goal for parkland designated properties. However, forest management is permitted in parklands if vegetation management is necessary to protect public health and safety, public interests, public assets, and/or restore or maintain recreation sites following significant natural disturbances or disturbance by destructive insects or disease, and if public health and safety are at risk, the removal of plantations to restore more natural and diverse vegetative communities. The project at the Beeman Pond Lot is currently being proposed at this time because the plantations are rapidly declining in health and vigor and offer little vegetative diversity, and public safety and assets are being jeopardized by the current forest condition. The goals of this project are to demonstrate harvesting techniques to prepare an even-age plantation of red pine, white pine, Norway spruce, and Scots pine for the regeneration of a mixture of native tree species, which builds on past management practices. To mitigate public safety risk by implementing silvicultural treatments that work to proactively harvest trees, which are rapidly failing in condition. To increase the vegetative diversity and structural complexity within the project area, to include a native assortment of plant species, including shrubs and herbaceous plants. To demonstrate and best management practices that protect forest productivity, soil and water resources, and finally to educate the public on forest management practices in the Otter River State Forest. With that being said, the campground itself will be excluded from the commercial operation. The campground in its current condition is better assessed and managed, including the facilitation of hazard tree removal projects by DCR's program and hired contractors who have the experience to handle hazardous trees in sensitive areas. Most of the trees in the campground contain nails and other hardware in their trunks and are in close proximity to pavement, overhead electric wires, and campground buildings. There will be 2 forest management approaches taken at this time to achieve the goals which I mentioned. The red pine and Norway spruce plantations will be treated with the even-age shelterwood regeneration method, with either a partial overstory removal or another shelterwood cut. The Scots pine and white pine plantations will be treated using an uneven age group selection method. This is the current condition of the red pine plantation. Tree health and quality are declining at this time. The crowns of the trees are dying back, and mortality from a red pine scale infestation is already evident in the plantation. The red pine scale insect was positively identified by DCR Forest Health Program in October of 2020. This plantation will be treated with the shelterwood regeneration method. The shelterwood method is a method of securing natural tree reproduction under the shelter of old trees, which are removed by successive cuttings to admit a gradually increasing amount of light to the understory growth. The successive cuttings are lumped into three basic categories. The first is the preparatory cut, followed then by the establishment cut, and finally by the final removal cut. The preparatory cut is aimed at strengthening and improving the vigor of existing trees destined to be left after the establishment cut. The harvests in 1989, 1993, and 2000 underwent this treatment type. The establishment cut was completed between 2017 and 2018. This cut focused on opening up enough vacant growing space to allow the establishment of regeneration, as well as to partially release the existing regeneration in the understory. The final removal cut is being proposed at this time for the red pine plantation. In areas where regeneration is adequate, the overstory will be partially removed from the site. This will flood the understory with full light conditions, which will be beneficial for optimal growth. The Norway spruce plantation will undergo another cut in the establishment cut category of the shelterwood regeneration method to increase the amount of growing space to allow the establishment of regeneration. The last method which will be used is called the uneven aged group selection method. It will be applied in the Scots pine and white pine plantations. These plantations are in very poor condition. They were planted in the 1930s and have seen little or no thinning since that time. Without management, they have stagnated in growth and are now declining rapidly in health and vigor. There is little to no live crown ratio remaining on the trees. Mortality is very high in these plantations. There are instances of dead trees throughout each plantation, some of which have fallen to the ground. The purpose for using the group selection method is that live trees in these plantations will not respond to thinning. They have become too stressed and have declined so tremendously that they literally do not have enough live vegetation growing on them to improve themselves on a scale large enough that they will effectively make this stand a more healthy and vigorous forest. During the last harvest in 2017-2018, 44 group openings were harvested. Each opening was under 1 acre in size. The regeneration response has been excellent within the openings as a result of the cutting. Shade intolerant to mid-tolerant species are regenerating the site, along with native herbaceous plants. By mimicking this treatment several times over the course of a few decades, in addition to the natural mortality that has been occurring here for over 20 years, it will create an uneven aged forest structure within the white pine and Scots pine plantations at the Beeman Pond lot. In addition to structural diversity, vegetative diversity will be increased by creating openings of various sizes and shapes. There is an extensive network of wetlands adjacent to and within the proposed harvest area, in addition to one intermittent stream. That stream will be crossed on the east side of Route 202 on a pre-existing skid trail that was utilized in the 2017 harvest. There will be no harvesting in wetlands. A review of the Natural Heritage Endangered Species Program Atlas showed no areas of concern regarding rare, threatened, or endangered species. Any and all cultural resources will be left undisturbed and will be mapped and sent to review by our DCR archaeologists for further direction. This is a photo taken in one of the group openings from 2017. As you can see, 4 years post-harvest, there is an abundance of growth. Most of the vegetation that is present includes blackberry and a dense cover of ground shrubs, as well as seedlings of shade-intolerant species such as aspen and cherry. Hardwood stump sprouts and advanced regeneration are also growing taller. Fern and forb growth is becoming dense, but is not expected to be problematic for regeneration establishment into the future. In another 10 years, I expect much of the forbs, blackberry, fern, and shrub growth to be overgrown by many overstory trees, which will eventually occupy the site, including white pine, red oak, red maple, black cherry, aspen, and others. This concludes my presentation for the Beeman Pond Lot 2.0 timber sale at the Otter River State Forest. I appreciate your attendance and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to discuss the project, and I'll look forward to answering any questions.
All right, thank you, Joelle, for that very nice presentation. I'm Malcolm Mitter. I'm an assistant professor of forest conservation at the University of Massachusetts, and I'll be leading the Q&A session. And so the structure for this evening's meetings are basically we're going to have these presentations on specific projects, and then we're going to follow up with some Q&A. Those questions can be either specific to that project that was presented or any general questions or comments that folks have. And so if you joined us a little bit late, we just heard a presentation by Joelle Ventura on a project within the Beeman Pond lot, which is within the Otter River State Forest. And so we're going to start the Q&A portion of this. And before I do that, I just want to hand things over to Pete Church to talk a little bit about the structure of our public comment period and the opportunities that you have to comment on the different projects that you're hearing about this evening.
Thanks, Malcolm. There were a couple comments in the chat regarding the concern about the virtual public meeting. And unfortunately, this is what we have for our virtual format due to the pandemic. Our hope is that at some point we can go back to live meetings. But I also want to say that any comments that are within the chat function, we will be responding to, and we do, as Tom had mentioned, if people have comments, they can certainly send them to the forestry.comments@mass.gov email site, and those comments will be accepted, and we will be answering comments back on those. So thanks, Malcolm.
All right, thank you, Pete. So our first question of this session is a general one, and it relates to forest carbon. And so the question is, how does the carbon sequestration in a young forest compare to an older forest? So Tom, would you mind answering that one?
Sure. In general, a young forest will take up and sequester more carbon. So our program takes into consideration three different things when it comes to climate change. One is carbon sequestration, carbon storage, and third is forest resiliency. More information can be found on our website, Managing for Carbon, and I would refer you there for more detailed information.
Okay, thank you, Tom. So we then have a question for Joelle, which is specific to this Otter River project. And so, Joelle, can you give us a little bit of details about previous treatments in this area and what type of harvesting was used, and did they overlap with your currently proposed projects, and in particular, what were the regeneration effects of those past projects?
Yeah, thank you, Malcolm. That's a great question. So the harvesting types that were done previously were in 1989, 1993, and 2000. And all of those areas that were harvested were additionally harvested in my 2017 project and will also be harvested in this go around. The types of harvest at that time were a part of the shelterwood harvesting system. It was a preparatory cut. It was the first entry to strengthen the residual overstory to basically bear seed. So it was two parts. It was to increase the health and vigor of the trees that were going to be remaining on site, as well as sort of opening up portions of the overstory to start to allow light to the forest floor. The regeneration response, particularly after 2000, was very robust. There's a very dense undergrowth of white pine in the areas that were cut. And we were fortunate enough to go back in 2017 and work off of those areas with that dense regeneration. White pine and red oak and black oak were the kind of the major species that regenerated the site. There was a lot of red maple as well, but those are mostly from stump sprouts. So the regeneration effect was outstanding, and being able to go back in 2017 and give light to that regeneration was really advantageous, and it's set up very well for what we have planned this time around.
Okay, great. Thank you, Joelle. So one of the things I'll be doing this Q&A too is if we receive specific comments relating to anything that we're talking about this evening, I'll also be reading some of those aloud just so they can be entered into the public record. And so one comment that we just received is thank you for incorporating sustainable forestry as a critical part of DCR stewardship to work toward balanced, resilient forests that provide a diverse suite of ecological and social benefits, including habitat, clean water, open space, and climate mitigation. Okay, so our next question is again a general one and relates to forest carbon. And so I'll be directing this to Tom. And so Tom, since you'll be measuring carbon flux, how will you keep track of the uses of harvested wood? For example, how much wood we burned as biomass, chips, or pellets or as firewood, thus going directly into the atmosphere? In addition, how will you measure your baseline carbon so you can follow and compare changes in carbon across all carbon pools, including carbon stored in soil?
Okay, good question, Malcolm. Thank you. Basically, we do not measure carbon on a specific stand-by-stand way. What we do is we take into consideration all the factors across our forest. And again, more detailed information can be found on our website, Managing for Carbon. So I would refer you there.
Okay, thank you, Tom. All right, and so, excuse me, 1 second, sorry. Okay, so we've got a question relating to DCR's hiring practices, and so I'll be directing this to Tom again. So Tom, when we live in an age of pro-forestation, why does DCR continue to hire foresters who do not have training in protecting biodiversity? So hoping you can address that one, Tom.
Yeah, I can address that. I'd be happy to. DCR takes biodiversity very seriously, and quite frankly, that's why I was hired. I have a degree in forestry as well as wildlife, and I do take climate change very serious. So that's about basically all I can tell you, but we do take it very seriously.
All right. So our next question is again specific to this project, and it's for Joelle. And so Joelle, can you talk a little bit about how this proposed project may impact the recreational use of this area? So in particular, how the proposed project won't have an impact, or how that project would impact the recreational use in this area.
So the impacts to recreation, they're kind of complex. So I'll start with recreational in terms of hiking. So during active harvesting, the area is closed temporarily to the public for safety reasons, not only for the user of the state forest, but also for the loggers who are operating. In addition to that, Otter River has a kind of a robust snowmobile system there, and I keep in very close communication with the Coldbrook Snowmobile Club about the timing of our harvest, when work is actively being done, when they're able to groom the trails, and that sort of a thing. So I try to keep lines of communication very open with that club, and also with our operations staff, the DCR operations staff, particularly the folks that are physically working at Otter River State Forest. If people come in asking questions or have concerns, you know, they're directed to me while the operation is ongoing. And in addition to that, I just want to, you know, reiterate the safety concerns that we have with these failing plantations. And we have a main hiking trail that goes through there. It's called the Wilder-Mackenzie Interpretive Hiking Trail. It connects the Beeman Pond and Otter River State Forest Campground to Lake Denison to the north. And these plantations have been declining for a long time, and in our cut in 2017, we took care of a lot of the hazard trees along that corridor, and we're going to do the same this time around, make sure we don't miss anything. it can just become a dangerous situation. So we're glad to be able to take away that safety hazard along that main hiking trail, and also along the interior forest roads that people tend to stick to as well when they hike and recreate out there.
The IPCC one?
Yeah.
That's the.
All right, thank you, Joel. And so our next question is a general one, and so I'm going to refer this to Pete. And so Pete, can you talk a little bit about, this relates to sort of general DCR management of public lands. And so can you explain a little bit about your legislative mandate to log within state parks, and in particular, what law gives DCR the right to manage our forests for, in particular, commercial timber sales?
Thanks, Malcolm. What I want to say on this one is, while there's past legislation and mass general law on the authorization of DCR to manage its forests, I want to point out to the Forest Future Visioning initiative that took place about 15 years ago. And out of that visioning came the landscape designations management guidelines recommendations. This was a comprehensive review of why we actively manage our forests. It was an extensive public process, meetings across the Commonwealth, and an outcome of these processes reaffirmed DCR's ability to actively manage our forests.
All right, thank you, Pete. So again, we now have a question that's specific to this project, so I'll direct it towards Joel. And so Joel, you mentioned not doing any of the work in a wetland area. And so sort of the comment or the question is, I imagine this is to avoid erosion and maintain shade trees. So of the disease species you're concerned about, are they adjacent to the wetland? And secondarily, are there healthy native species present in those areas or spaces?
So there are no plantation species. Well, I should say, if there were plantation species planted in wetlands, they did not survive. So those wetlands are filled with native vegetation, which we're grateful for. The plantations are planted immediately to the edge of wetlands. In 2017, I did cut up to the edge of some of the wetlands. Luckily, there was a kind of natural buffer around the majority of them. And if the wetlands were located in a space that was away from trails or roads, I tended to leave the plantation trees there because they didn't pose a safety risk. And that is to maintain that shade and that buffer of that wetland. And also just for the duration of the overstory's life. It's mostly, the red pine is mostly what's buffering these wetlands. So that was kind of the approach I took, and the approach I'll take again with this harvest, although most of the cutting adjacent to those wetlands has already been complete. So there'll be even more of a natural buffer this time around than in 2017.
Okay, thank you, Joel. I know we have some additional general level questions that have been asked during this Q&A session. In the interest of time, we're going to move on to our next presentation, and so I will be handling those general questions as part of the next Q&A. So I'm going to turn things back over to Tom to set up our next presentation.
Thank you, Malcolm. We're now going to hear from Joelle. She has another presentation. This one's going to be on the Lawton State Forest. So.
Hello, my name is Joelle Votor, and I am the Mid-State Management Forester for the Department of Conservation and Recreation, Division of State Parks and Recreation. This evening, I will be presenting information regarding 2 harvesting project proposals located within the Lawton State Forest. One project is named Willis Road North, and the other is Willis Road South. Both of the project areas are located at the Lawton State Forest. Lawton State Forest is located in the town of Athol, Massachusetts, off Willis Road, Townsend Road, and Chestnut Hill Avenue. It is 365 acres and is located south of Tully Lake, north of Athol Center, and is surrounded by private abutters. Lawton State Forest is made up of two primary acquisitions. The first acquisition was part of a strategic conservation effort made in large part by the Mount Grace Land Conservation Trust in 1986. And the second was a purchase of a parcel that was made in 2001 that encompasses the northern end of the property. The state forest is named after the Lawton family, who at the time of state acquisition had owned and managed the property for over 200 years. The last Lawton family member to own the property was Robert H. Lawton. Until the 1930s, the property was a dairy farm operated by Robert's father, while also managing its forest stands for lumber on the side. In 1932, Robert's son, Richard, wanted to raise money for his Boy Scout troop. What started as a fundraising idea became a larger vision for utilizing the old farmlands to grow and raise trees for lumber and Christmas trees. Over the next several decades, Robert Lawton raised, planted, and managed hundreds of acres of trees on his family's farm. In time, the Lawton Tree Farm became the first American tree farm in Massachusetts and the second in the nation. Becoming a member of the American tree farm system was reserved at this time for land that was being managed in an exemplary fashion. In 1986, the Lawton Tree Farm was being threatened by a 200-home development project. With much local opposition, the property was enrolled in the Chapter 61 current use program, and the town assigned the Mount Grace Land Trust with the right of first refusal. The organization purchased the property and subsequently sold the land to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Department of Environmental Management, which is today's Department of Conservation and Recreation. At the time of purchase, the state maintained a commercial contract with two private residents to manage some of the last remaining Christmas tree plantations on the property. By 2008, the Christmas tree plantation was long abandoned and was mowed using grant money from the Ruffed Grouse Society as a part of a larger wildlife habitat project that was conducted in central Massachusetts and on several state forests. I'd like to begin my project level discussions with the Willis Road North project. As the name implies, this project is located north of Willis Road and west of Townsend Road. The project area is 122 acres in size. Within the proposed 122-acre project area are pure even-age stands of red pine, white pine, and Norway spruce, as well as areas containing a mixture of these species. Areas between the plantations contain naturally seeded native tree species. Stand types will be delineated based on the results of a site-specific forest stand exam, which will be conducted at a later date in the future. The dominant overstory species include red pine, eastern white pine, Norway spruce, Scots pine, northern red oak, and eastern hemlock. Other species include paper birch, black birch, red maple, and other mixed hardwood species. The condition of the plantations is fair to poor. Red pine quality is poor due to growth stagnation and what is assumed to be a red pine scale infestation. The red pine stand is currently dying back, with some pockets of mortality and other areas with reddening tree crowns. The Norway spruce plantation is in fair condition, but wind throw is evident in many areas from some of the stronger storms we have had in the recent past. White pine plantation condition is fair. There are some areas of the plantation containing trees with a small live crown ratio, likely caused by growth stagnation and fungal infections on the needles. The non-plantation forests are a white pine, oak, and hemlock stand type that is structurally even-aged and is in good condition. In 2003, 90,000 board feet of red pine, white pine, and Norway spruce saw timber and 120 cords of mixed softwood pulp were harvested on 35 acres within the proposed area. Besides this treatment, there were no records of previous management except the general knowledge that sawn timber was cut and sold commercially by the Lawton family until 1990. This project is being proposed at this time because the plantations are at a high risk of mortality from insect and disease, and public safety and assets are being jeopardized by the current forest condition. In addition, advanced regeneration established through previous treatments may be adequate at this time for further release through a partial overstory removal or with a continuation of the shelterwood regeneration method. The goals of this project are to demonstrate harvesting techniques in an even-aged red pine, Norway spruce, and white pine plantation that build on past management and natural disturbances to facilitate the regeneration and conversion to native species, to mitigate public safety risk by implementing silvicultural treatments that work to proactively harvest trees which are rapidly failing in condition, and to finally increase the vegetative diversity and structural complexity within the project area, which will include an assortment of native plant species, including shrubs and herbaceous plants. There will be two forest management approaches taken at this time to achieve the goals which I mentioned, which will fulfill the goals of maintaining a diverse and resilient native and natural forest as outlined in the DCR Management Guidelines document. The red pine, white pine, and Norway spruce plantations will be treated with either the even-aged shelterwood regeneration method or a partial overstory removal. The intensity of the harvest will be adjusted based on the presence of regeneration, indicating a more intensive partial overstory removal where regeneration is ready to be released, and another shelterwood harvest in areas where more regeneration needs to be secured. A partial overstory removal, or the cutting of the upper canopy trees, will be used to proactively salvage the declining plantations while simultaneously releasing the advanced regeneration that has become established as a result of past forest management efforts. The goal of another shelterwood harvest at this time would be to increase the available light to the forest floor to aid in the partial release of established advanced regeneration, or to encourage the establishment of regeneration where it might be absent. Areas within the proposed project area that contain naturally seeded native trees will undergo a variable density thinning across all size classes. The purpose of this treatment is to increase species diversity and vertical complexity, which will create a more resilient forest condition. This is a photo of the Templeton State Forest's Hadley-Aiken lot after the implementation of a partial overstory removal. The regeneration in the understory was suitable for an overstory removal, meaning that the species present in the understory were well suited to the site conditions. The stems were at a height where they were considered established, and the site contained the appropriate number of stems per acre. The native forest stand will be treated with variable density thinning. The purpose of this treatment is to increase species diversity and vertical complexity, which will create a more resilient forest condition. This visualization shows an example of this type of treatment taken from the U.S. Forest Service publication titled Guide to Variable Density Thinning Using Skips and Gaps by Brody and Harrington. In this visualization, Section A is a depiction of an even-aged forest condition with little variation in species composition. Section B shows variable density thinning in that same stand using skips and gaps, which can help accelerate the development of structurally complex features in a forest, such as a late successional forest, which is shown in Section C. In Section B, the area on the left was skipped, as it was not harvested at all. The middle section was harvested using a gap, whereas understory vegetation will be released by cutting the overstory, which allows more resources for the understory to grow. The section on the right was thinned to promote the increased growth of the residual trees remaining. The second and final project is Willis Road South. The project is located south of Willis Road and west of Townsend Road. The project area is 108.8 acres in size. While portions of the property were planted to a mixture of species described for the Willis Road North project, much of the proposed project area contains a native even-aged forest stand of a white pine oak eastern hemlock type. The stand is structurally uniform, containing mature trees that are in stable condition. There is a very small inclusion of a red pine, white pine, and Norway spruce plantation along Willis Road. An entry in 2006 harvested 58,000 board feet of red pine, eastern hemlock, white pine, and Norway spruce saw timber, in addition to firewood and softwood pulp in a thinning. The majority of this work was done nearest to Willis Road. This project is being proposed at this time to explore a collaboration with the University of Massachusetts Amherst to both study the interaction between vegetative diversity, forest management, and forest carbon stocks in flux, and engage in outreach on those interactions with the public and practitioners of forest management. The goal of this project is to increase the vegetative diversity and structural complexity within the project area to include an assortment of native plant species, including native shrubs and herbaceous plants. The proposed project area will be treated with the uneven age group selection method. Areas between the groups will be treated with variable density thinning. Group sizes will vary but are not to exceed 1 acre. The desired feature condition of this stand is an uneven aged forest with a diverse mix of native species, as well as increased forest complexity and structure over time from this entry and subsequent entries. The amount of light that will reach the forest floor by using group selection and variable density thinning will create the growing conditions to support the growth of a variety of tree species. This includes shade-intolerant species such as cherry and birch, mid-tolerant species such as oak and pine, and shade-tolerant species such as hemlock and sugar maple. The group selected for removal will be located based on many factors, including the proximity to high-quality seed trees, patches of less desirable or poorer quality trees, and presence of advanced regeneration from previous disturbances. Variable density thinning will focus on the removal of trees with poor vigor and growth habit amongst all size classes. This will provide better growing conditions for the retained trees into the future. In these ways, this treatment will fulfill the goals of maintaining diverse and resilient forests as outlined in the DCR Management Guidelines document, as well as furthering DCR's mission of collaboration and outreach. Regeneration and residual stand monitoring will be conducted into the future before another entry is scheduled. The intent is to let this stand develop into an uneven age stand by repeating this type of treatment in future entries. The number, size, and location of future group openings will be dependent on the presence of regeneration, the condition of the residual stand, and the natural factors that might complement the presence of new group openings, such as pockets of natural disturbances. There are many cultural resources located throughout both project areas. All cultural resources will be mapped and brought to the attention of DCR's archaeologists for further review. In addition, there are many wetland resources located throughout both project areas, including 3 potential vernal pools. All wetland resource areas will be protected per the guidance of the Massachusetts Forestry Best Management Practices Manual in accordance with Chapter 132 of the Forest Cutting Practices Act. There will be no harvesting in wetlands. Streams and wetlands may be crossed, but only when necessary to minimize greater impacts to the site. There is currently no areas identified by Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program of special concern to protect of rare, threatened, or endangered species. The cutting plan will be reviewed by Natural Heritage at the time it is filed in case any atlas changes have been made or has been updated to show or reflect any changes to that. Many of the old farm and logging roads are now used as recreational hiking trails. It is likely that many of these roads will be used as primary skid roads to reduce ecological impacts to the site. Trailbed protection and restoration after harvesting will be made to the extent possible. Tree cutting will occur up to the edges of these roads, particularly where hazardous trees are present. During active logging operations, the area will be closed to all users with signs posted along main hiking routes. Equipment limitations will be made based on wood products being harvested. Past harvesting operations since 2000 on this site included a cut-to-length processor and forwarder. A similarly mechanized operation is to be expected. Use of machinery to cause soil scarification in areas with low levels of advanced regeneration is also likely. Existing landing sites, such as this one on Townsend Road, will be reutilized for Willis Road North. 2 existing landing sites will be reutilized for Willis, with 1 additional landing needing to be established on Townsend Road. Skid trails will be properly stabilized to prevent erosion and sedimentation, with the use of things such as water bars, hay bale installation, and flash. Access by off-road vehicles will be restricted by additional blockages where access is becoming a problem. Monitoring of the harvested areas will be implemented in the future. Monitoring will help identify areas of invasive species establishment and to determine when future entries would be appropriate, as well as to monitor the growth response to the treatments prescribed by these projects. This concludes my presentation for the Willis Road North and Willis Road South projects. Thank you very much for attending and giving me the opportunity to discuss these projects. I'll look forward to answering any questions that you might have.
All right, thank you very much, Joelle. Again, my name is Malcolm Itter. I'm an assistant professor of forest conservation at University of Massachusetts, and I'm basically serving as a moderator for this question and answer sessions. And so we just heard from Joelle Vautour on several different proposed projects occurring within the Lawton State Forest. And now we'll shift back to the Q&A portion of this meeting and have some questions specific to this project, as well as some general questions as well. And so the first question during this Q&A is directed towards Tom. And Tom, can you talk a little bit about why the state doesn't use pro-forestation approaches in their management practices?
Sure, good question. Thanks, Malcolm. DCR manages for a variety of stewardship values: wildlife, recreation, forest products, just to name a few. Climate change is a real big one right now. And right now, we look at reports from, like, with our counterparts at Fish and Wildlife, the Partners in Flight, Mass Audubon, and all indication shows that our forests are out of balance. We need some more young forest and we need some more old forest, and that's what we're striving for. But we cannot longer, we can't just put our heads in the sand and hope that a natural disturbance is going to cure all of our needs for forest products, wildlife habitat, etc. So we just don't look at one, because society requires us to manage for all of these values and not just one. Hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you, Tom. So we have a question. Well, first, I want to just read a comment to be entered in the public record, which is plantations degrade our forests, so thank you for restoring natural biodiversity. And then our next question here is for Joelle. So Joelle, is it true that all native species of trees in Massachusetts regenerate themselves, meaning that no native species would need to be replanted? I'm assuming post-harvest.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's absolutely true. We are fortunate enough here in Massachusetts where if you stopped mowing your lawn, natural forest succession would take hold. And over time, you would go through an early successional, mid to late successional forest structure and all the species that interact with all those systems. So that's a great question, and it's absolutely true.
All right, thank you, Joelle. And so our next question is a bit of a general one, so I'll direct this to Pete Church. And so Pete, can you talk a little bit about why DCR continues to plan the same sort of logging projects when there's so much public opposition to selling our public forest using commercial timber sales?
All right, thanks, Malcolm. While there is some opposition, it is not a lot of opposition. I will say that in general, many people agree with the management practices that we have on DCR properties. I want to point to a couple things that I encourage people to take a look at. One is our landscape designation management guidelines document on why we manage the designations that we have on our properties, woodlands, reserves, and parklands. And then I also want to point out to people why we manage for carbon. And we have a website, Managing for Carbon on DCR property. We measure carbon on a landscape scale. So through our continuous forest inventory system, we have over 2,000 plots across the state. We've been inventorying those for over 60 years. And I encourage you to look at the website, take a look at what is behind that inventory process and how we measure for carbon. Thanks, Malcolm.
All right, thank you very much, Pete. And so our next question is a bit of management specific, so I'll direct this to Joelle. Joelle, can you talk a little bit about how DCR plans to deal with the presence of red pine scale at the state level? And in particular, the recent infestations seem to be posing a significant threat to plantations. and recent studies seem to suggest that the scale is gaining steam as climate changes. So could you comment generally regarding DCR's management strategies to deal with infestations of other pests and pathogens due to climate change, and I guess in addition to that red pine scale?
Sure. So in terms of red pine scale on state property, I know myself and my counterparts across the state have basically been proactively trying to salvage some of these plantations before they decline to the point of mortality. And in other cases, we've had stands of dead plantations, of red pine plantations, where we've had to go in after the fact and either pay to have it salvaged or to salvage it and turn a profit on it if the plantations weren't too far gone. I know in my district alone, I've been working almost exclusively in the past 10 years on hundreds of acres of red pine plantations to try to mitigate the loss and reduce the safety hazards of the red pine plantations. I'm not super familiar with how scale moves and climate impacts on their movement. I had a conversation with our forest health director last fall when she positively identified scale at Otter River. And a lot of the research that she was familiar with, there really wasn't a rhyme or reason why, like even at the Beeman Pond, for instance, a part of the plantation is significantly more infested with red pine scale than the other. And there's really no rhyme or reason for that. And a lot of research hasn't been done to answer some of those questions to her knowledge. And I haven't looked into it a lot myself. The one other thing I will mention, just from my observations alone, are the white pine needle funguses that are native to this region of Massachusetts, and how climate has been affecting kind of the way it interacts with our native white pine trees in the region. And you know, we've had a lot of really wet springs, and we've seen portions of at least northern Worcester County be really severely impacted by our native pathogens that affect trees. So it's definitely something that I think we're paying attention to, and the question would be so much better answered by our forest health director. But it's, I think it's something that we're all paying attention to in our own respective regions, and definitely stepping in when we see serious problems or ways that we can mitigate serious problems.
All right, thank you so much, Joelle. So we have another general question here, so I'll direct this to Tom. And so Tom, we hear so much about trees, a few invasive plants, and wildlife. And so what about the vast majority of biodiversity in other taxa, such as fungi, insects, and other arthropods, mosses, lichens, etc.?
Yeah, exactly. That's a good question. Whenever we put a proposal out together, it goes through an internal review. So that's natural heritage endangered species, mass wildlife, and even our own ecology program looks at that, and we look more than just timber or just your average wildlife. We do take a good look at it and come up with a really good plan.
All right, thank you, Tom. So we're getting a number of questions regarding forest management and its relation impacts on forest carbon. And so I just want to turn things over to Pete to talk a little bit about some of the resources that we have about states management for forest carbon.
Thanks, Malcolm. Again, I would echo what I said previously. I would encourage people to look at our carbon page, Managing for Carbon, and look at that and how we dissect and review what we do on a landscape scale.
All right, thank you, Pete. I have an additional comment here to be read into the public record, and so I'll read this aloud. So the conservation of Lawton tree forest is integral to the origin story of Mount Grace. While we are extremely proud of the history of the tree farm, Mount Grace is committed to protecting the rich biodiversity of our region. Mount Grace enthusiastically supports the DCR proposal to manage this forest to enhance species diversity in a variety of age classes. Personally, I enjoy hikes through these woods weekly as they as they are adjacent to our Mount Grace headquarters. I'm looking forward to returning to these walks in future years, knowing that the forest will be more resilient to climate change, as well as providing improved wildlife habitat as a result of the proposed forest management work. Mount Grace is in the process of a pollinator project in our arboretum at Skyfields. I believe this proposed DCR cut will complement the work we are undergoing, planting native plants and controlling invasives. So our next question as part of this Q&A is again a bit general, so I'll direct this to Tom. So Tom, why is everything being planned some sort of clear cutting or all even age management when your own when DCR's own landscape designation document says that even age treatments will be very rare and only used under exceptional circumstances? And then a secondary or follow-up question is, are there any forests in DCRs that are just left alone?
Well, yes, the even age management, usually it's in the form of shelter woods, is done mostly to deal with forest health issues while promoting wildlife habitat. And it is allowed in the landscape designation document. And are there lands within DCR that are not logged? Yes. 30% of DCR's lands are kept in what we call forest reserves. While the reserves are designated for quote unquote natural processes, we still manage for invasive species within the reserves, as well as we've even sprayed some of the trees to retain some of the large trees, which are, under stress from the hemlock woolly adelgid. So yes, we have areas that we don't quote unquote log and that we let somewhat of a natural process take over. And these are the forests we hope to, to bring along for a really late cereal type forest. Hope that answers your question.
All right, thank you, Tom. I just want to turn things over to Pete for a moment to address some of the nature of the comments and questions that we're receiving in the Q&A right now.
Thanks, Malcolm. There are some comments that are coming through that are bordering offensive. So I would encourage people, this is important to us. This is important to the people that are on this virtual meeting. Please keep your comments civil and just encourage you to be constructive. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Pete. So our next question is for Joelle. And Joelle, can you elaborate a bit more on the interaction between these proposed projects and recreational use within the broader Lawton State Forest?
Sure. So this property, as I mentioned in my presentation, has a lot of land use history, and most of the I'll start with hiking. I'll start with the trails. Most of our trails are on old farm roads, old logging roads, and they are now recreational hiking trails. So these roads were built where they are by the Lawton family for a lot of reasons. There are many wetlands, many streams on the property, and the wetlands are avoided by these roads, and the streams are crossed on these roads in locations that were most appropriate for what really in areas that cause most minimal impact to the site, which is really great for us because we can reutilize these roads instead of build new ones for our harvesting operations. So roads aside, and other types of recreation, there are a couple of beautiful ponds on the property. Those areas will be buffered very widely for the most part, unless there's hazard trees nearby on some of the trails that kind of skirt around them. So recreational impacts to those sites will be really minimal. And in terms of folks who like to get kind of off the beaten path, I think that my management will diversify the site. It will change the aesthetics of the current condition. I think hunters will be appreciative in the long term, in a few years from now, about the regeneration and the growth that comes in, and the forage opportunities for certain wildlife. People who go out to hunt, not necessarily hunt, but just go out to observe wildlife, I think will be equally as pleased. So I think, in the long run, I think the recreational benefits could be enhanced by this work.
All right, thank you, Joel. So one more project-specific question here, and then we'll end this Q&A session, and any questions that haven't been addressed, we'll try to answer in the last Q&A session of the evening. So Joel, can you elaborate a little bit on some of the potential wildlife habitat benefits that will be realized from this project? And a follow-up question would be, what feed sources will be present in improved habitat features?
Sure, that's a great question. Thank you, Malcolm. So, you know, with variable density thinning, I think kind of the beauty of that sort of a management approach is that we will have these skips and we'll have these gaps. So within the gaps, we're going to be opening up the canopy. You know, the current forest condition is largely an intact, mature overstory. So allowing these areas where there's just a flush of light to the understory, we can get kind of a young forest condition growing in these gaps. Will be beneficial to, you know, different types of birds that don't live within a mature wooded setting. Some of the songbirds that we see, you know, on a declining state throughout the Commonwealth will move into these places and nest or forage on bugs and different, you know, vegetation that comes up in those gaps. And then we'll have, you know, in the areas that are skipped, we'll have the, you know, the species that are present now maintaining themselves. And then in terms of the plantation work, you know, I've done a lot of work in red pine plantations, and I've done some overstory removals in the past, and I've been able to observe the regeneration growth and the change in particularly the birds that I hear that come into these sites. And it's really a profound change. It's a change from birds that you hear in an intact dense forest to, you know, a young forest condition, birds that I would never hear in that alternative site. So there will definitely be a change, definitely new opportunities for some wildlife species, and that, you know, that's just a result of any, it would be a result of any natural disturbance, as, you know, just as it would in this type of forest management being proposed.
All right, thank you so much, Joel. So I know we've got a couple additional general questions that have been posed during this session. In the interest of time, we're going to move on to our last presentation of this evening's session. And just a reminder that we will have a final Q&A round following that presentation, and so we'll be posing those questions at that time. And again, if we don't have a chance to get everyone's questions, they will be addressed. They're into the public record, and they will be addressed at a later date. So Tom, you want to introduce the next presentation, please?
Yeah, thank you, Malcolm. Yeah, the next project we're going to hear is a really unique project down on the Myles Standish State Forest around the Charge Pond Complex, and it's done by Forester Paul Gregory, who has extensive knowledge in working with fire species as well as public safety on our forest down in the eastern part of the state. So we can hear Paul's presentation.
Afternoon. I am Paul. Good afternoon. I am Paul Gregory, the Management Forester for the Southeast District for the Department of Conservation and Recreation. I will discuss the proposed forest management project in Myles Standish State Forest, whose principal objective is to protect campers of the Charge Pond Campground Complex in the event of a wildfire. Governor Polito. DCR is in the executive branch, which is led by Governor Baker and Lieutenant Governor Polito. DCR is in the Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, headed by Secretary Theo Herides, and DCR is led by Commissioner Montgomery. Parks, greenways, historic sites. DCR is steward to one of the largest state park systems in the country. It is made up of over. I will start with a little bit of background. This area was used seasonally by the Wampanoags, and some of the roads through the state forest are their old travel routes. In the late 1700s, bog iron was found in area bogs, and as such, pots, kettles, baked pans, and stoves were produced at local iron furnaces. Cannonballs were also produced, and some went to the USS Constitution during the War of 1812. Large amounts of wood were needed to make charcoal for the furnaces. There were 9 furnaces operating in the surrounding towns. One furnace might use as much as 90,000 cords of wood for charcoal a year. By 1830, the area was a cut and burned over forest. Many of the bogs mined for iron were reused for cranberry bogs in the mid-1800s and are still in use today. Myles Standish State Forest is one of the earliest state forests, and it's also one of the largest, covering over 12,000 acres. Myles Standish received a reserve designation through the 2012 landscape designation process, with parkland areas around the campgrounds and wildlife management areas, as seen here in pink. Myles Standish State Forest is home to the Pine Barrens, a globally rare natural community, typically made up of an open canopy of pitch pine above a shrub layer dominated by scrub oak and heath species. Wildfires have played a significant role in shaping the natural and physical features of this area of the state. This is a list of the larger fires in Myles Standish since becoming a state forest. Over 50% of Myles Standish has seen a wildfire since becoming a state forest in 1960. The Charge Pond Campground Complex was burned in a wildfire in May of 1964. There are 7 campground loops with approximately 250 campsites in total, with a maximum occupancy of approximately 1,250 people in the Charge Pond Campground Complex. We are proposing to mechanically thin between campground loops in the Charge Pond Campground Complex to reduce the natural fuel load and thereby reducing the wildfire danger. We will also create a designated safety zone to provide a safe area for the public to take refuge in the event of a wildfire. Lastly, the ongoing larger joint Myles Standish Complex Pine Barrens Restoration Project with Mass Wildlife will be expanded to include 142 additional acres. These operations will protect campers in the event of a wildfire, lessen fire danger, and will provide safe access for firefighters and fire apparatus. The result will also restore and maintain native pitch pine and scrub oak natural community, benefiting a variety of rare, declining, and common species. We talk a lot about pine barrens, and I wanted to give some key elements of this community. Barrens typically occur in poor sandy soils that tend to have a scattering of trees. These environmental conditions are naturally harsh, and as a result, specialized plants have adapted to these areas. Due to their unique environmental conditions and connection to fire, barrens are associated with many rare species, with a few shown here. This part of the state is a hotspot, with Myles Standish State Forest alone having 37 rare species. Barren communities also provide important habitat for numerous game species, such as the American woodcock, ruffed grouse, and wild turkey. The motivation for this project came from the draft Myles Standish Planning Area Fire Management Plan. It recommends implementing fuel reduction around campgrounds at Charge Pond and improving the safety zone at North Beach of Charge Pond. Most of Myles Standish State Forest has been designated as a reserve, but this area of the state forest is designated as parkland due to the campgrounds. Silvicultural treatments are permitted in parklands to protect public health and safety, as well as for the restoration, maintenance, or enhancement of habitats for rare and endangered species in exemplary natural or rare communities. In addition, all forest management proposals undergo an internal and external review by our ecologists, cultural resources personnel, as well as by Mass Wildlife and Natural Heritage. Thinning between campground loops will occur on approximately 34 acres, shown here in this aqua crosshatch. The safety zone will be approximately 7.4 acres, where all trees and shrubs will be removed or mowed in place, shown here in red. The area of the safety zone is based on the National Wildfire coordinating group recommendations, the larger joint project with Mass Wildlife to restore over 2,000 acres of pine barrens will be expanded to include 142 additional acres, as shown here in the dark orange horizontal hatch. On the recreational side, forest roads, trails, and paved bike paths do go through the project area. On a more typical forest management project, we would have trail buffers where we would limit cutting, but in this case, to reduce the fuel load and to provide the opportunity to educate the public on the project, we will not have buffers. The areas will be closed to the public during active operations. Extending the existing paved bike path approximately 170 feet to connect to the safety zone will be discussed with park operations. There are no wetland resources or vernal pools within the project area. Charge Pond exists south of the safety zone. Larger trees will be cut and removed to reduce accumulation of material that would otherwise occur through mulching. Smaller trees and brush will be mulched in place. A 50-foot no-cut buffer, to be confirmed by staff, will be established from all campground sites and paved roads to reduce direct visual contact with the project. This map shows the untreated areas where no cutting or mowing will occur to provide a buffer to campsites. The primary goal is to reduce the fuel load in and around the Charge Pond Campground Complex to protect campers in the event of a wildfire. Thinning between campground loops will occur and will be based on research conducted at the University of Massachusetts under the direction of Dr. Patterson, a fire ecologist. Spacing will be based on a tree's diameter. The larger the diameter, the larger the spacing. For example, a 12-inch diameter tree will be at least 33 feet from any other tree, whereas a 6-inch diameter tree will be at least 16.5 feet from any other tree. The secondary goal is to restore and maintain native pitch pine and scrub oak natural communities with a focus on a savanna condition of individual, larger diameter filigree pitch pine trees in the overstory with an understory of scrub oak and other native shrubs. Reducing the canopy cover will result in an open habitat benefiting a variety of rare, declining, and common species. The operational window is from mid-October to mid-May. Therefore, the project will not interfere with the camping season. These are examples of the types of equipment used in the past for mechanical operations. The desired future condition is an open canopy of pitch pine above an understory of scrub oak, heath, and grassy glades. The project will reduce wildfire risk to the Charge Pond Campground Complex. If you would like to comment on the proposed project, comments can be sent to forestry.comments@mass.gov. That concludes my presentation. Thank you for your interest and attention.
All right, thank you, Paul, for that nice presentation. So we'll open up the Q&A session, our final Q&A session of the evening. Just a reminder, my name is Malcolm Mitter. I'm an assistant professor of forest conservation at the University of Massachusetts, and I'm serving as an impartial third-party moderator for these Q&A sessions. And we just heard, if you joined us late, we just heard an interesting presentation on a proposed project within the Charge Pond campground region within the Myles Standish State Forest. So we'll now open up the Q&A portion. And so our first question here, this is a general one, so I'll direct this to Pete. And so Pete, can you talk a little bit about, or specifically, is the Mass State Forest Action Plan and Wildlife Action Plan considered within the framework of the Landscape Designations Management Guidelines document?
So I can speak, thanks Malcolm, I can speak to the State Forest Action Plan because it was internally done by staff from the Bureau of Forest Fire Control and Forestry. A good part of that drew off of the Landscape Designation Management Guidelines document. So certainly on the DCR lands, that are represented within the State Forest Action Plan. A good amount of the material that came from landscape designations can be seen in the State Forest Action Plan. The State Wildlife Action Plan is done by the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, and we collaborate with our sister agency on sharing information on our State Forest Action Plan, and they in turn do it for the State Wildlife Action.
All right, thank you, Pete. Before we go to our next question, I just want to read a public comment here to be entered into the record. And so great to see that DCR is both restoring globally rare pine barrens while substantially reducing fire danger for the high numbers of recreational users at Myles Standish, a real win-win. And so our next question here is also a general level. I'll address this question to Tom. So Tom, can you talk about how DCR sprays trees, and do you use any sort of sorry, I'm going to mess this up, neonicotinoid pesticides?
Yeah, with regards to neonicotinoids, I would have to refer you to the Forest Health Program, but most of the spraying that we do are for invasive species, which are herbicides and do not contain any insecticide.
Okay, thank you, Tom. So a general question for Pete. Pete, since old growth forests are now vanishingly rare in Massachusetts, what is DCR doing to increase the representation of truly old forest habitat?
Thanks, Malcolm. Certainly, we have extensively mapped the old growth forest network on DCR lands. The majority of the old growth forest lands on DCR lands are within reserves. Those are areas that we don't do active management. And areas that do have old growth that are not in reserves, we certainly will not be doing any type of management in those areas.
All right, thank you, Pete. Tom, can you talk a little bit about the percentage of DCR public lands logging that are logged that result in biomass for, what percentage, I'll read this again. So what percentage of DCR public lands logging results in biomass for wood chips or pellets?
I can't answer the percentage portion of that question because our permits do not dictate the end use, and biomass markets on our lands are fairly limited. So I'd have to research the percentage part, but I imagine it's very, very, very low.
All right, thank you, Tom. So an additional comment here to be read into the public record. So I applaud these DCR projects that seek to convert poorly structured plantations to forests that are more diverse in composition, age classes, native species, and forest types and communities that are more resilient in the face of climate change. We have another general question that I'll refer to Tom for. And so Tom, can you speak to the high standards that we have in Massachusetts for sustainable forestry?
Yeah, absolutely. Chapter 132 has some of the highest standards for BMPs in the country. And the management forestry program, at very minimum, will meet those BMP standards. In fact, we usually exceed those by doing things such as not cutting within the buffer strip areas.
All right, thanks, Tom. Where could folks find information on those BMPs if where it's available? Can you refer, is there a way to send a link or something like that? Maybe in the response to questions, we can share a link to the BMPs.
Yeah, the BMPs can be found on our website. Service forestry is where you would find them.
All right. So another general question coming in here. I'll point this to Peter Church. So Pete, can you speak to the budget for DCR management for the DCR management forestry program?
Sure, Malcolm, thanks. This question has been asked in the past, and it's important to understand the way DCR agency works. salary, and I'll speak to my bureau, the Bureau of Forest Fire Control and Forestry. Within the bureau, there are 100 full-time employees. They're broken up into various programs: forest health, urban and community forestry, service forestry, management forestry, and forest fire control. And the way the budget is broken up, it isn't broken up by salary. So there's a general appropriation code for all staff that DCR maintains. There's a budget for our bureau, an operating budget for our bureau, but it doesn't get broken up into specific programs. And the other thing I want to mention is that besides what we're talking about today, that the management foresters do, they do a whole lot more for the agency. So it's not just doing active forest management on state lands. They're the eyes and ears of our forest. They see things that no other DCR staff see. So it's important to note that it's not just it's only one aspect of what they do. So I just want to enforce that. Thanks, Malcolm.
All right, thank you, Pete. So we've got a question here that I'll direct to Paul. So Paul, can you talk a little bit about, so the question here is, young forest and shrublands habitat has been identified as an important habitat in Mass Wildlife's Wildlife Action Plan. Nearly 30 species, excuse me, my screen just changed. Nearly 30 species of the greatest conservation need depend upon this habitat, yet this habitat has declined dramatically through time. How can DCR's forest management activities help to reverse these trends?
Thank you, Malcolm. This is Paul Gregory, if people aren't heard my voice before. As Tom pointed out, a lot of our forests are in that middle successional stage, and by having forest management projects, we can chip away at that low percentage of early successional habitat, which we are doing. And we also do that, and we also maintain those habitats through our prescribed burning program as well.
All right, thank you, Paul. So we've got an additional question here that I'll address to Tom. So Tom, can you please expand upon or expand on the current annual DCR state forest growth rates compared to the annual harvest plus mortality rates in terms of forest sustainability, and further expand on how important active forest management is to increasing biodiversity goals at a landscape scale?
Yeah, everything is accounted for. Our growth and everything is accounted for by our CFI program. And currently we are cutting way below growth, and our young forests are also way below the targeted range. We tend to want to mimic fish and wildlife as far as creating young to old forests. So hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. So again, we're getting a lot of questions relating to forest management and its impacts on forest carbon. So Pete, would you mind just sharing again for folks who may have joined late some of the resources that are available for folks to learn more about DCR's approach for managing for forest carbon?
Sure, and I've said this earlier in the presentation. I would like remind people to go to our Managing for Carbon webpage. It talks specifically about some of the questions that were asked here. It's important to know that our continuous forest inventory network allows us to track growth. It allows us to track mortality and harvest levels, and it tells us that harvest levels are far below our growth levels. The other thing that's important to note is looking at mortality, general mortality of our forest. And I'll give an example. In 2016 and 2017, we had severe gypsy moth defoliation. Approximately almost 900,000 acres of our state was defoliated at one point. In combination with that, we had a pretty bad drought year in 2017. what that turned out to be, it was about 60,000 acres of dead oak over the course of the state. And every year, our forest health program flies our state, looks at defoliation patterns, and certainly this is one way we keep track of the forest health situation in Massachusetts.
All right, thank you so much, Pete. There's a couple of additional comments that have come in that I'll read just to be entered into the record. And so I support DCR's forest habitat projects for Otter Creek, Lawton, and Myles Standish. The Mass Forest Action Plan calls for managing forest ecosystem managing forest ecosystem health and biodiversity. This work is good for biodiversity. And the second comment here, thank you for dealing with the red pine stands at Otter River. I can't wait to see that area rehabilitated and given a chance to come back with the species that are meant to be there. And so with that, I think we'll end our Q&A, our last Q&A session of the evening. And I'll turn things back over to Pete to sort of give us an outro here, and also to maybe just, if we didn't have a chance to address all the questions that were posed during the Q&A period, Pete, where folks can find answers to those questions.
Great, thanks, Malcolm. I want to first thank all our presenters today for the work that they've done in preparing for these public meetings. I want to thank the audience. There were some really good questions there. There were some challenging questions, but appreciate your input. As we've said, if we haven't gotten to your comment or question, we will get to it after the comment period ends on August 31st. And we will be responding to questions that come to us. So again, thank you very much for participating, and have a good night.